Maps erased, cities rebuilt, millions counted, filed, and forgotten. Across Asia and Europe, massive stone halls, endless railways, and vanished districts point to something hidden in plain sight. Who planned it all? Who tracked every worker, every brick, every boundary? Why were entire neighborhoods wiped from records? And why do the archives still whisper about systems too vast to ignore? What survives isn't legend. It's paperwork, and it changes everything. A name that drifted across maps. For several centuries, many European and American maps used the word Tartary for a wide span of northern and central Asia. The label did not point to a single state with fixed borders. It moved between mapmakers, editions, and languages, sometimes narrowing to a corridor of steppe and river systems, sometimes widening until it touched the Pacific. A recent review by the Library of Congress describes Tartary as a toponym that appears from the 13th to the 19th century, and notes that two maps from different makers rarely place it in exactly the same way. The word itself came into English through Latin Tartaria, meaning the land of the Tartars, a term long applied by outsiders to groups of mainly Turkic peoples across Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. Over time, European writers blended Tatar with the older Greek idea of Tartarus, which is one reason an extra R often appears in Western spellings. The same Library of Congress account points out that whether most of the people being described called themselves Tartars or called their lands Tartaria is doubtful, and it connects the term's spread to the limited and uneven knowledge Europeans had about the interior of Asia across many generations. In printed cartography, one early landmark is Abraham Ortelius's Theatrum Orbis Terrarum in 1570, which included a dedicated map labelled for Tartaria. The Library of Congress highlights this specific inclusion as a turning point. Earlier printed Ptolemaic atlases could show Scythia, Sogdia, India, and Serica, but not Tartaria, while Ortelius's atlas gives the name a formal place in a work that circulated widely among educated readers and map buyers. The label entered a commercial system where map plates were recopied, updated, and reissued, and names could persist even as the ground-level political landscape shifted. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, map titles and legends show how the term could function like an umbrella. One example is Guillaume de Lisle's Carte de Tartarie, dated 1706 and published in Paris. The catalogue description from the David Rumsey map collection records the full title, which states that the map was drawn from reports of travellers of different nations and from observations made in the country itself, and it notes visible features such as forested areas and the Great Wall, with relief shown pictorially. The sheet's purpose was not to announce a unified empire, but to reconcile scattered travel reports into a coherent geography for European readers. De Lisle's wording matters because it reflects a method that was becoming more explicit in European mapmaking. The relations of travellers could include missionary letters, embassy journals, merchant itineraries, and translated court records. These sources were uneven in quality. They also used different naming systems, often filtering local terms through Russian, Persian, Manchu, or Mongolian intermediaries. In that environment, Tartary could sit beside more specific qualifiers on the same map, dividing the interior into sections associated with Muscovy's frontier, Qing rule, or independent Khanates, without requiring a single administrative structure behind the label. The Library of Congress post illustrates this tendency by pointing to map details that include multiple Tartary place names rather than one uniform block. The 18th century also produced a second kind of Tartary document, not an atlas sheet for a drawing room, but a technical map tied to state competition and war. Philip Johann von Strahlenberg, a Swedish officer captured during the Great Northern War, spent years as a prisoner in Tobolsk, a Siberian administrative center. Later, accounts of his work describe how he compiled geographic material between 1709 and 1722 and published a major map in 1730 with Johann Anton von Matern, presenting Russia, Siberia, and what Western sources often called Great Tartary. The same description notes that the map was later re-engraved for an English edition in 1736, a reminder that the label moved across languages and print markets. That background places Tartary inside an era when Russia was pushing deeper across Siberia and when European states wanted better information about river routes, resource zones, and the chain of forts and towns that supported long-distance travel. Tobolsk itself had been founded earlier, in 1587, and became a key administrative point in Siberia. A prisoner living there would have been close to officials, merchants, interpreters, and the steady traffic of reports moving west. When later European readers saw Tartary printed across enormous spaces, they were often seeing a shorthand for regions that Russian administrators, steppe polities, and Qing officials would have described with different terms and divisions. In parallel, European printed reference works used Tartary as a geographic heading in the same broad sense. The term appears throughout 18th century English texts as a way to group territories and peoples beyond the more familiar boundaries of Europe. It could sit near names like Muscovy and China, reflecting older conventions in which geography was taught through large regional blocks. The persistence of the word in print did not require that a single Tartary government existed. It required only that the label remained convenient for Western readers who wanted a stable name for regions they did not visit. The 19th century gradually changed the naming system. As Russian imperial administration expanded, and as Qing boundaries and internal divisions became more legible to outsiders through diplomacy, trade, and conflict, Western maps began to prefer narrower terms. Siberia, Mongolia, Manchuria, Turkestan, and named Khanates increasingly replaced the umbrella label. The Library of Congress account frames this as part of the reason Tartary vanishes from modern maps. The area once tagged with that name did not disappear, but the mapping conventions did. Modern interest in Tartary often begins with the visual shock of seeing the word printed large on an old map. That reaction is understandable because older cartography uses large type for regions, not only for countries, and because the scale makes the label feel political even when it is primarily descriptive. Map titles such as Delisle's Carte de Tartary, with its appeal to traveller reports and observations, show how a cartographer could treat Tartary as a working category rather than a constitutional entity. A single printed word can appear stable even when its meaning shifts from plate to plate. The archives preserve that stability because ink does not update itself. When Tartary is read today, it is being read through the habits of modern political maps, not through the older habit of labeling vast, partly understood interiors with a single term that could stretch and contract as information arrived, from steppe reports to survey lines. In the archive of the Russian State Library, there are notebooks from provincial clerks dated to the 1740s that begin with lists of villages, distances measured by horse travel, and notes about frozen rivers. These records were not intended for publication. They were working documents used to calculate taxes, supply routes, and administrative responsibilities. Over time, thousands of similar pages were gathered and copied. Together, they formed the raw material from which later maps and surveys were constructed. During the early 18th century, the Russian Empire began to systematize this type of information. In 1720, Peter I authorized the expansion of state cartographic work through the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. Officials requested standardized reports from governors, military engineers, and postal inspectors. These reports included route lengths, river crossings, and settlement inventories. The process replaced earlier reliance on individual travel narratives with coordinated data collection. Ivan Kirillov played a central role in organizing these materials. As Secretary of the Senate, he supervised the compilation of geographic information between 1727 and 1737. Surviving correspondence shows him requesting corrections to river courses and asking local officials to verify distances. His unfinished atlas, later completed by other scholars, presented Siberia and adjacent regions with consistent scales and symbols. Major waterways such as the Irtysh and Angara were plotted in relation to known forts and towns. Scientific expeditions reinforced this administrative mapping. The first Kamchatka expedition under Vitus Bering, conducted from 1725 to 1730, recorded coastal outlines and inland routes. Astronomical measurements were taken at key points to establish latitude. These data were sent to St. Petersburg, where they were compared with earlier sketches and revised. The second Kamchatka expedition, running from 1733 to 1743, expanded this framework across northeastern Asia. Participants in these expeditions kept daily logs, Some entries list weather conditions, travel time, and compass bearings. Others describe river widths or mountain passes. When compiled, these observations reduced the need for broad regional terms. Officials could refer instead to specific valleys, watersheds, and administrative districts. By mid-century, Russian cartography increasingly reflected this approach. Provincial maps produced in Tobolsk, Irkutsk, and Yakutsk were aligned to common reference points. Copies were stored in central archives. When foreign mapmakers consulted Russian sources, they encountered detailed subdivisions rather than generalized regions. In France, similar institutional changes were underway. The Académie des Sciences and the Dépôt de la Marine promoted standardized observation techniques. Surveyors were trained to record angles, distances, and elevations using calibrated instruments. Their measurements were preserved in technical reports that circulated among specialists. Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville's maps illustrate this method. His 1,737 map of Asia relied on verified coordinates and rejected decorative speculation. Large blank spaces marked areas without reliable data. Where earlier maps had displayed expansive labels, d'Anville inserted river names, caravan stations, and known settlements. The visual emphasis shifted from regional identity to positional accuracy. British geographic practice followed a related pattern. After 1767, the East India Company supported systematic surveys of the Indian subcontinent. These efforts culminated in the Great Trigonometrical Survey, formally established in 1802. Survey teams constructed chains of triangles across plains and mountains. Each point was measured relative to fixed baselines. Under leaders such as George Everest, surveyors extended these methods toward Himalayan and Central Asian borderlands. Stone markers and signal towers were erected on peaks and ridges. Observations were repeated over months to correct for atmospheric distortion. The resulting maps presented distances and elevations with unprecedented precision. Information from explorers supplemented these measurements. William Moorcroft's travels in the early 19th century produced route descriptions through Central Asia. Alexander Burns later compiled hydrographic and urban data from Bukhara and surrounding regions. Their journals were deposited in British archives and incorporated into official cartographic revisions. Russian expansion into Central Asia intensified this process. After the 1860s, military campaigns were accompanied by engineering surveys. The Turkestan Topographical Survey employed officers trained in triangulation and leveling. They mapped irrigation canals, urban grids, and caravan roads. Towns such as Tashkent were documented block by block. These surveys produced multi-sheet map series. Each sheet included legends specifying measurement methods, reference meridians, and scale ratios. Earlier regional labels were replaced by district names, station numbers, and elevation figures. The maps functioned as administrative tools for taxation, policing, and infrastructure planning. Qing China developed parallel systems. During the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, Jesuit missionaries and Chinese officials collaborated on imperial surveys between 1708 and 1716. Using quadrants and star charts, they fixed coordinates across Mongolia, Tibet, and Xinjiang. These materials were preserved in court archives and later consulted by European scholars. When 19th century Western atlases incorporated Qing data, they adopted these administrative divisions. Regions once grouped under broad labels were reclassified according to provincial and banner systems. By the late 19th century, international cartography was shaped by shared technical standards. Projection methods, contour intervals, and symbol conventions were discussed in professional journals and conferences. The International Meridian Conference of 1884 established a common reference for longitude, further aligning national mapping systems. Archival maps from this period reveal dense networks of information. Railway lines are annotated with kilometre markers, border posts are numbered, postal routes are traced with precise intervals. The visual field is filled with technical detail rather than regional headings. Older terminology did not disappear immediately. Some popular atlases continued to use traditional names in decorative cartouches or historical sections. However, in administrative and scientific contexts, these terms had little function. Survey coordinates and cadastral registers defined space more effectively. The replacement of generalized regions with measured units was gradual and cumulative. It depended on thousands of observations, corrections, and revisions. Each new survey reduced reliance on inherited descriptions. Each new archive catalogue integrated local data into centralized systems. By 1900, most official maps of northern and central Asia consisted of layered grids, elevation profiles, and jurisdictional boundaries. The transformation reflected institutional routines rather than ideological change. Steppe reports, missionary letters, and merchant itineraries had been translated into standardized measurements. Rivers were indexed, settlements were catalogued, roads were classified. The landscape appeared not as a broad expanse under a single name, but as a collection of mapped units connected by surveyed lines, stone facades, and the language of empire. A ledger kept by the City Engineering Office of Tobolsk in 1856 opens with measurements of foundations, notes on soil stability, and records of brick deliveries delayed by spring floods. The document contains no commentary on style or symbolism. It lists wall depths, kiln output, and the number of labourers assigned to each section. Comparable notebooks appear in provincial archives across northern Asia and Eastern Europe, forming a technical record of how large structures were planned and executed. Municipal administrations in the 19th century increasingly required such documentation. Construction permits, insurance registries, and tax assessments demanded precise descriptions of buildings. In Kazan, an inventory from 1,842 lists warehouses along the Volga River, with wall thickness measured in arshins and roof spans expressed in standardized units. In Irkutsk, insurance files from the 1870s include diagrams of courtyards, staircases, and load-bearing beams. These records classify buildings by district and function, not by broad regional identity. The spread of stone and brick architecture across territories once grouped under older geographic labels has later been interpreted as evidence of a unified architectural source. Archival material suggests a different process. Many large civic and administrative buildings were erected during periods of imperial expansion under ministries that maintained centralized design standards and reporting systems. In Omsk, the Governor-General's house, completed in 1862, illustrates this pattern. Construction contracts preserved in regional archives list suppliers of limestone, timber, and iron fittings. Correspondence between the provincial governor and the Ministry of Internal Affairs discusses budget revisions and staffing. The building's neoclassical proportions match design templates used in administrative centers throughout the Russian Empire. Railway infrastructure provides another consistent record. When construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway began in 1891, the Ministry of Transport issued standardized station plans. These documents specified brick dimensions, roof pitch, platform height, and window spacing. Stations in Novosibirsk, Krasnoyarsk, and Chita resemble one another because they were produced from shared technical drawings. Progress reports detail the establishment of brickworks and sawmills near construction sites. Central Asian cities underwent comparable changes after Russian annexation in the 1860s. In Tashkent, municipal council minutes from the 1870s record funding allocations for administrative buildings, schools, and hospitals. The Governor-General's Palace, completed in 1870, was constructed under the supervision of military engineers. Expense ledgers list imported iron beams and locally produced bricks. Urban expansion followed surveyed grid patterns approved by provincial authorities. Samarkand's administrative quarter reflects the same system. Building permits and cadastral maps from the late 19th century show planned streets, drainage channels, and public squares. Engineering reports describe reinforcement methods for masonry structures in seismic zones. These documents situate construction within established technical practices. Qing administrative architecture followed separate but equally documented procedures. Provincial archives contain records of timber procurement, brick firing schedules, and labour assignments for government complexes. Manuals derived from earlier texts, such as the Yingzhou Fashi, continued to influence official building standards. Structures in Manchuria and Xinjiang were built under provincial supervision, with cost accounts submitted to central offices. Religious architecture also generated extensive paperwork. Orthodox cathedrals in Siberia required approval from both ecclesiastical and civil authorities. The Cathedral of the Nativity in Krasnoyarsk, completed in 1849, appears in diocesan correspondence detailing fundraising campaigns and material shipments. Quarry records identify local stone sources, while foundry reports list cast iron decorative elements. Large-scale industrial facilities were similarly documented. In Tyumen and Tobolsk, dockyards and warehouses constructed along river routes appear in shipping company archives. The Ob River Steamship Company's reports from the 1880s list pier dimensions, storage capacities, and maintenance costs. Telegraph stations built after 1860 are recorded in Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs files, including insulation specifications and pole spacing. Harbin illustrates later phases of this process. Established in 1898 as a railway hub, the city developed under the Chinese Eastern Railway Administration. Architectural plans preserved in Russian and Chinese archives show phased construction schedules. Material import logs record steel shipments and prefabricated components transported from European Russia. The presence of European-style facades corresponds to railway governance rather than undocumented predecessors. Census records reinforce this picture. The 1,897 Russian Empire census lists construction-related occupations in provincial towns, including masons, plasterers, metalworkers, and surveyors. Payroll registers show seasonal fluctuations tied to building campaigns. These data connect architectural output to known labor systems. Urban planning files reveal deliberate regulatory frameworks. Street widening projects, zoning ordinances, and sanitation improvements were debated in municipal councils. In Tashkent, minutes from 1,877 onward document drainage installation and road paving schedules. Brick production statistics appear in annual industrial summaries. Technical education networks supported these developments. Engineering institutes in St. Petersburg and Moscow distributed pattern books and instructional manuals. Circulars issued by ministries outlined acceptable construction methods. Graduates were assigned to provincial posts, carrying standardized practices with them. Correspondence files show requests for updated plans and clarification of specifications. Engineering journals of the period describe how projects were adapted to local conditions. Articles discuss winter masonry techniques, frost-resistant mortar, and foundation reinforcement in permafrost zones. These publications circulated among specialists and were cited in official project reports. Industrial exhibitions displayed the results of this system. Catalogues from the 1,882 All-Russian Industrial and Art Exhibition in Moscow list bridges, trusses, and prefabricated structures produced by domestic firms. Technical descriptions include load calculations and material tests. Many exhibited components were later installed in provincial projects. Photographic collections provide visual records of construction phases. Sergei Prokudin-Gorsky's early 20th century images show scaffolding, unfinished facades, and material stockpiles. When compared with building registers, these photographs confirm documented timelines. Across regions, architectural uniformity reflects coordinated administration and shared technical training. Stone facades, vaulted halls, and iron frameworks appear where ministries, engineers, and supply networks intersected. Each structure is associated in archives with permits, budgets, and named supervisors. Claims of impossibility often arise from the scale of these works and the environments in which they were built. Contemporary reports explain the methods used to address climate and distance. Winter transport routes, seasonal labor camps, and modular construction reduced logistical barriers. The surviving record links major buildings to institutional systems rather than to undocumented origins. Contracts, surveys, payrolls, and photographs form a continuous trail. These materials situate architectural development within 19th century administrative and industrial structures. What emerges from the documents is a pattern of planned expansion. Cities were equipped with standardized public buildings, transport hubs, and service facilities. Similar appearances resulted from shared regulations and training, not from a single unknown source. Exhibitions, technology, and public measurement. The catalogue of the All-Russian Industrial and Art Exhibition, held in Moscow in 1882, devotes several pages to bridge segments, steel beams, and prefabricated roof trusses. Weight, material composition, and load capacity are recorded for every entry. No language frames these objects as symbols of national pride. They are presented as tested components intended for transport, assembly, and inspection. Comparable catalogues were later produced for exhibitions in St. Petersburg, Nizhny Novgorod, and regional centres. Industrial exhibitions became regular features of 19th century public life. They were organised by ministries, trade associations, and municipal councils. Their purpose was to display manufactured goods, engineering systems, and building materials. Visitors included officials, engineers, merchants, and students. Reports from these events were filed in government archives and technical journals. The Nizhny Novgorod Fair, held annually from the early 19th century, combined commercial exchange with technological display. By the 1870s, exhibition halls included steam engines, hydraulic presses, and iron framework samples. Inventory lists preserved in provincial records show serial numbers and factory origins for each machine. These records allowed administrators to compare production standards across regions. At the 1896 All-Russian exhibition in Nizhny Novgorod, organizers constructed large pavilions using steel and glass. Engineering reports describe how prefabricated sections were assembled on site. Structural calculations were published in technical supplements. The exhibition's electrical lighting system was mapped in diagrams showing generator placement and cable routing. International exhibitions followed comparable formats. The Great Exhibition of 1,851 inches London, housed in the Crystal Palace, established a model for displaying industrial capability. Russian, Qing, and Central Asian manufacturers participated in later European fairs. Shipment records document the transport of machinery and building components to Paris in 1867 and Vienna in 1873. These events created shared measurement systems. Machines and structures were evaluated using standardized units. Weight was expressed in poods or kilograms, distances in versts or meters, and pressure in calibrated scales. Technical committees verified these figures before publication. Exhibition catalogues thus became reference documents for engineers and administrators. Railway technology featured prominently. Scale models of bridges, locomotives, and station platforms appeared at most major exhibitions after 1870. The Ministry of Transport submitted detailed specifications for rolling stock and track systems. Diagrams displayed rail profiles, ballast layers, and signal mechanisms. These materials were later used in training programs. Hydraulic and irrigation systems were also presented. At exhibitions in Tashkent and Samarkand in the 1890s, regional administrators displayed canal gates, pumping devices, and reservoir plans. Agricultural departments prepared maps showing water distribution. Reports compared efficiency figures between traditional and mechanized systems. Electrical engineering became increasingly visible after 1880. Generators, transformers, and lighting networks were exhibited with explanatory charts. The Moscow Polytechnic Museum preserved demonstration equipment used at public lectures. Maintenance manuals distributed at exhibitions described wiring standards and safety procedures. Construction materials formed another major category. Brick manufacturers displayed samples with compressive strength tests attached. Cement producers published curing time data. Iron foundries provided tensile strength tables. These figures were reviewed by inspection boards and entered into official registers. Technical education institutions used exhibitions as extensions of their curricula. Students from engineering schools attended guided tours and received printed summaries. Examination syllabi from St. Petersburg Polytechnic Institute reference exhibition catalogues as supplementary material. Instructors assigned comparative analyses based on displayed equipment. Colonial and frontier regions were integrated into this system. Exhibits from Siberia and Central Asia included timber products, mineral samples, and structural components. Shipping manifests list railway wagons carrying these items to exhibition sites. Regional administrators submitted explanatory notes describing production conditions. Qing China organized similar displays in treaty ports and provincial capitals during the late 19th century. Industrial expositions in Shanghai and Tianjin presented textile machinery, dock equipment, and municipal infrastructure models. Customs reports recorded foreign and domestic exhibitors. Technical handbooks accompanied these events. Photographic documentation played a growing role. Exhibition organizers hired photographers to record pavilion layouts and machinery installations. Albums from the 896 Nizhny Novgorod exhibition show interior steel frameworks and assembly stages. These images were archived alongside engineering reports. Public lectures accompanied many exhibitions. Transcripts preserved in newspapers and institutional records show engineers explaining load calculations, ventilation systems, and material testing methods. Speakers often cited published standards and recent experiments. These presentations reinforced a shared technical vocabulary. Inspection committees evaluated exhibits before and during events. Their minutes list compliance checks, recalibrations, and safety reviews. In some cases, defective equipment was removed from display. These procedures reflect regulatory oversight rather than promotional spectacle. Exhibitions also served administrative functions. Ministries used them to compare suppliers and select contractors. Procurement files reference specific exhibition entries when awarding infrastructure contracts. A bridge design shown in 1882 could reappear in tender documents several years later. Transportation networks supported this circulation. Railway timetables were adjusted to accommodate exhibition traffic. Freight schedules prioritized machinery shipments. Customs offices processed temporary import licenses for foreign equipment. These logistical arrangements are documented in Transport Ministry correspondence. Standardization extended beyond machinery. Architectural models displayed at exhibitions illustrated school buildings, hospitals, and administrative offices. Pattern books derived from these models circulated among provincial engineers. Building committees referenced them when approving local projects. By the late 19th century, exhibition culture was integrated into bureaucratic routines. Annual reports summarized technological trends observed at fairs. Statistical yearbooks included data derived from exhibition testing. Engineering journals reviewed new materials first presented in pavilion displays. The presence of similar machines and structural systems across distant regions reflects this exchange network. Equipment shown in Moscow or Paris could later appear in Irkutsk or Harbin through documented procurement channels. Assembly instructions, spare parts lists, and maintenance schedules accompanied each transfer. The technical language used in exhibition materials remained consistent. Terms for stress, resistance, and efficiency followed international conventions. Translation committees adapted foreign manuals into Russian, Chinese, and Turkic languages. These translations were archived and reprinted. Industrial exhibitions functioned as public laboratories. Components were weighed, tested, compared, and recorded. Their performance was measured against published standards. The resulting data circulated through ministries, schools, and professional societies. The archival trail of these events consists of catalogues, inspection reports, shipping logs, photographs, and lecture transcripts. Together, they show how large-scale construction and infrastructure were framed within measurable systems. The emphasis lay on reproducibility, verification, and administrative oversight. Through repeated exhibitions, technical practices were normalized. Engineers, officials, and contractors encountered the same measurement frameworks and documentation methods. This environment supported large, coordinated projects without relying on informal transmission. The material record of exhibitions connects architecture, machinery, and infrastructure to institutional evaluation processes. Public display was linked to testing and record keeping. Objects presented as examples were also treated as data sources. Maintenance, repair, and the paper trail of use. Railway inspection books, preserved in the archives of the Ministry of Transport from the 1890s list, bridges according to serial number, river crossing, and structural type. Each page records dates of examination, measurements of metal fatigue, and notes on timber deterioration. Marginal annotations indicate when provisional supports were installed or when reinforcement was approved. These registers were revised regularly and circulated among regional engineering departments. Public buildings generated comparable documentation. Municipal ledgers from Tomsk in 1874 record roof repairs to the provincial courthouse after heavy snowfall. The entries specify quantities of replacement tiles, wages paid to carpenters, and hours of labor. Hospital maintenance books from Orenburg in 1889 detail chimney inspections, boiler cleaning, and window frame replacement. The tone of these records remains administrative and procedural. Climatic conditions across Siberia and Central Asia placed consistent stress on infrastructure. Frost movement affected foundations. Seasonal floods undermined embankments. Wind abrasion damaged exposed masonry. Engineering offices responded by establishing inspection cycles and standardized reporting formats. These routines became embedded in administrative regulations. Railway systems developed some of the most detailed maintenance structures. Track supervisors submitted monthly assessments of rail wear, ballast displacement, and sleeper decay. After 1875, the Ministry of Transport distributed printed inspection forms with predefined fields for location, material type, and recommended intervention. Completed forms were archived and referenced in budget planning. Depot workshops maintained parallel records. Locomotive repair logs from Krasnoyarsk in the 1890s document boiler retubing, axle realignment, and wheel replacement. Parts inventories list manufacturing origins and delivery dates. Correspondence between depots and central offices records requests for specialized components and authorization for extended shutdowns. Bridges received heightened attention due to their strategic importance. Inspection manuals required periodic stress testing. Reports from Ob River crossings during the 1880s describe controlled trials using weighted wagons. Engineers compared observed deflection with original calculations. Results were transmitted to provincial headquarters for review. Building maintenance followed similar administrative patterns. Provincial engineering offices kept registers for schools, barracks, and administrative complexes. Files from Tashkent in the 1870s include drainage repairs, plaster restoration, and foundation stabilization. Accompanying sketches identify problem zones and proposed corrective methods. Fire insurance companies contributed additional layers of documentation. Insurers required regular inspections to evaluate structural risk. Reports from Irkutsk and Tobolsk describe roofing materials, heating systems, and distances between adjacent buildings. Copies were often shared with municipal authorities. Religious institutions maintained independent maintenance archives. Diocesan offices preserved renovation accounts for cathedrals and parish churches. Correspondence from Krasnoyarsk records funding for roof reinforcement and interior restoration. Invoices list stone suppliers, metal workers, and transport costs. Telegraph and postal networks depended on systematic upkeep. Ministry of Posts and Telegraph's files contain schedules for pole replacement, wire tension regulation, and insulator cleaning. Weather damage reports were transmitted through coded messages. Repair crews operated under standardized deployment procedures. Water supply and drainage systems generated extensive records. Municipal waterworks logs from Samarkand in the 1890s, track pipe corrosion, valve replacement, and reservoir maintenance. Chemical analyses of water samples were attached to reports. Sanitary committees reviewed these findings and issued directives. Industrial facilities were subject to inspection regimes. Factory inspectors visited mills and foundries to assess structural stability and machine safety. Certificates list boiler pressure limits, ventilation conditions, and emergency shut-off mechanisms. Non-compliance resulted in written warnings and scheduled follow-up visits. Maintenance expenditures were integrated into financial administration. Provincial treasuries allocated annual repair budgets based on previous records. Proposals included cost projections for routine and emergency works. Approval processes are documented in ministerial correspondence and accounting files. Employment data intersected with maintenance systems. Payroll registers identify permanent staff assigned to upkeep, including masons, mechanics, and surveyors. Seasonal labor contracts appear during peak repair periods. These agreements were archived alongside project files. Photographic documentation supplemented written reports. Inspection teams attached images showing corrosion, cracks, and subsidence. Railway department albums from the early 20th century include annotated photographs linked to report numbers. These visual records supported technical evaluations. Professional journals summarized maintenance practices. Articles in late 19th century engineering periodicals discuss repainting intervals for iron structures and mortar composition for cold climates. Authors cited field data submitted by provincial offices. These publications circulated among engineers and administrators. Qing administrative systems maintained parallel documentation. Provincial Yamen files include petitions for repairs, requisitions for materials, and labor assignments. Memorials submitted to central authorities summarized major restoration efforts. banner administrations in Manchuria and Xinjiang preserved similar registers. British-controlled territories in adjacent regions developed comparable practices. Public Works Department files from northern India and border districts document bridge strengthening and road resurfacing. Selected reports were exchanged through diplomatic and technical channels. Long-term building histories emerged from these accumulated records. A courthouse or station can be traced through decades of inspection reports, repair invoices, and modification approvals. Roofing materials, heating systems, and foundation reinforcements appear in successive entries. Natural disasters produced additional documentation. After the 1887 Verney earthquake, inspection teams generated standardized damage classifications. Repair schedules were prioritized according to these reports. Mechanical systems followed strict maintenance protocols. Power generators, pumps, and heating installations were logged according to operating hours and lubrication cycles. Replacement schedules were recorded in equipment logbooks reviewed by supervisory engineers. Administrative correspondence reveals how maintenance issues moved through bureaucratic hierarchies. Letters requested funds, justified delays, and confirmed completion. Marginal notes indicate approvals and revisions. Multiple copies were filed in different departments. Insurance claims extended the archival trail. After damage incidents, insured parties submitted repair estimates, inspection certificates, and photographs. Settlement files preserve these materials alongside payment records. Training manuals reinforce systematic upkeep. Engineering schools taught inspection techniques and documentation standards. Examination papers included sample maintenance reports. Graduates entered service familiar with established reporting formats. These cumulative practices framed infrastructure as a continuous process. Design specifications served as reference points rather than permanent endpoints. Structures were expected to be monitored, adjusted, and renewed. Maintenance archives connect construction to long-term operation. They record material aging, performance deviations, and technical adaptations. Repeated inspection and repair integrated buildings and networks into routine administration. Schools, manuals, and the architecture of instruction. Enrollment lists from the St. Petersburg Institute of Engineers of Communications in 1869 record students according to province of origin, prior military service, and assigned specialization. Marginal notes indicate examination results in geometry, mechanics, and materials science. Similar registers appear in Moscow, Kazan, and later in Tomsk and Tashkent. These documents show how technical education was formalized through standardized curricula and centralized oversight. During the 19th century, imperial administrations invested heavily in specialized training institutions. Engineering schools, technical institutes, and military academies expanded in response to growing demands for surveyors, builders, and maintenance supervisors. Instruction combined classroom study with supervised fieldwork. Course schedules, preserved in academic archives, list subjects such as structural calculation, bridge design, hydraulics, and construction law. The St. Petersburg Technological Institute, founded in 1828, became one of the primary centers for industrial education. By the 1850s, its graduates were employed in railway construction, mining operations, and public works departments. Examination papers from this period show uniform problem sets based on standardized formulas and reference tables. Instructors emphasized reproducibility and documentation. Printed manuals formed the backbone of this system. Ministries commissioned handbooks that outlined approved methods for surveying, masonry, metalwork, and drainage. One widely circulated example, Guide to Practical Engineering Works, published in 1847, included sections on foundation preparation, mortar composition, and load distribution. Revised editions incorporated field observations submitted by provincial engineers. These manuals were distributed through official channels. Shipping logs indicate bulk deliveries to regional administrative centers. Library inventories from Irkutsk and Omsk list technical handbooks alongside legal codes and statistical yearbooks. Marginal annotations in surviving copies reveal active use, with calculations and corrections added by local practitioners. Military engineering schools played a parallel role. Cadets trained at institutions such as the Nikolaev Engineering Academy studied fortification design, bridge construction, and logistics planning. Lecture notes preserved in personal archives show detailed diagrams of bastions, culverts, and temporary crossings. Graduates were assigned to frontier regions where infrastructure development was ongoing. Translation committees expanded access to foreign technical literature. Works by French and German engineers were rendered into Russian, Chinese, and Turkic languages. The Ministry of Public Education maintained registers of approved translations. These texts introduced standardized terminology for stress, resistance, and efficiency. Revised glossaries accompanied later editions. In Qing territories, technical instruction followed different administrative traditions but shared similar goals. Provincial schools trained officials in hydraulic management, road construction, and building supervision. Manuals derived from earlier dynastic texts were supplemented with new materials translated from European sources. Examination essays from the late 19th century reference both classical and modern engineering concepts. Apprenticeship systems complemented formal schooling. Construction firms and railway workshops maintained training programs for junior technicians. Employment contracts specify probationary periods and skill assessments. Workshop notebooks record lessons on machine maintenance and metal fitting. These records situate technical learning within everyday labor environments. Professional societies reinforced instructional networks. Engineering associations organized lectures, published proceedings, and reviewed new methods. Membership lists from the Russian Technical Society in the 1870s include provincial engineers, railway supervisors, and factory inspectors. Meeting minutes record discussions of material failures and design revisions. Journals circulated these debates. Periodicals such as Engineering News and Transactions of the Technical Society published articles on bridge collapse analysis, boiler safety, and foundation settlement. Authors cited case studies drawn from inspection archives. Readers were encouraged to submit field data, creating feedback loops between practice and publication. Curricula were periodically revised to reflect these exchanges. Ministry directives updated examination standards and textbook lists. Circulars from the 1880s instruct instructors to incorporate recent findings on steel fatigue and concrete curing. Copies of these circulars appear in university and provincial education archives. Field training formed an essential component of instruction. Students were assigned to survey expeditions, railway construction sites, and urban improvement projects. Diaries kept by trainees describe measurement exercises, material testing, and report writing. Supervising engineers evaluated performance using standardized forms. Mapping schools also contributed. Surveying institutes trained specialists in triangulation, cartography, and geodesy. Course materials include star charts, leveling tables, and projection diagrams. Graduates supplied state mapping offices with skilled personnel capable of maintaining consistent reference systems. Instructional models extended to colonial and frontier regions. Technical schools were established in Tashkent, Harbin, and Vladivostok. Enrollment records show mixed cohorts of local and metropolitan students. Teaching materials mirrored those used in central institutions, adjusted for regional conditions. Railway administrations developed internal training programs. Manuals for station masters, signal operators, and maintenance supervisors were printed in large runs. These texts detailed procedures for inspections, incident reporting, and equipment handling. Revisions were issued after major accidents or technological upgrades. Industrial firms maintained their own educational departments. Foundries and textile mills produced instructional booklets on machinery operation and safety standards. Personnel files indicate mandatory training sessions for new employees. Examination results were sometimes tied to promotion eligibility. Libraries and reading rooms supported continuous learning. Provincial technical clubs stocked journals, manuals, and foreign textbooks. Lending registers show repeated borrowing of structural engineering and hydraulics volumes. Marginal notes in library copies suggest collaborative study. Public lectures extended technical knowledge beyond professional circles. Municipal records describe evening courses for craftsmen and supervisors. Attendance lists include carpenters, masons, and machinists. Lecturers followed ministry-approved syllabi, ensuring alignment with official standards. Correspondence between instructors and ministries reveals ongoing negotiation over content. Letters request clarification on new regulations, funding for laboratory equipment, and approval of experimental teaching methods. Responses include annotated draft syllabi and budget authorizations. Standardized examination systems reinforced uniformity. Test papers from different institutions display similar problem structures. Grading rubrics specify acceptable calculation methods. Appeals files document disputes over assessment results, illustrating administrative oversight. Practical demonstrations were incorporated into instruction. Laboratories, equipped with testing machines, allowed students to measure tensile strength and compression limits. Equipment inventories list calibration schedules and replacement parts. Experiment logs were submitted as part of coursework. These educational systems produced a shared professional language. Terms for stress distribution, load factors, and material coefficients appeared consistently across manuals, reports, and correspondence. Translation committees maintained terminological stability across languages. Graduate placement records connect training to deployment. Ministry rosters assign newly certified engineers to specific districts. Performance evaluations follow these assignments, linking educational background to administrative careers. Over decades, this network of schools, manuals, journals, and examinations standardized technical practice. Individual innovation occurred within regulated frameworks. Deviations were documented, reviewed, and either incorporated or rejected through institutional processes. The circulation of instructional materials created continuity across vast territories. A bridge inspector in Siberia and a canal engineer in Central Asia consulted similar reference texts. Training experiences overlapped despite geographic distance. Technical education also shaped record-keeping habits. Students were taught to document measurements, procedures, and outcomes in prescribed formats. These habits carried into professional life, reinforcing archival consistency. Instruction was not confined to initial training. Refresher courses and updated manuals addressed emerging technologies. Directives from the early 20th century mandate retraining in electrical systems and reinforced concrete techniques. The accumulated educational infrastructure functioned as an administrative backbone. Knowledge moved through syllabi, examinations, and publications. Authority was embedded in textbooks and certification systems rather than in formal tradition. Through regulated instruction, technical competence became a measurable qualification. Diplomas, licenses, and examination scores served as credentials. These documents determined access to projects and positions. This framework enabled large-scale coordination without reliance on localized custom. Measurement, documentation, and certification structured professional activity. Instruction functioned as a mechanism for administrative continuity. Labor columns and the arithmetic of scale. Camp registers kept along the Irtish construction corridor in 1893 open with daily headcounts taken at dawn, followed by notes on tool distribution and ration issuance. Each page lists names, assigned sections of embankment, and expected output measured in cubic sajen of earth moved. Weather remarks appear in narrow margins, while totals are recalculated at the end of each week. These notebooks were forwarded to district offices and incorporated into regional progress summaries. Large infrastructure projects depended on layered labor systems. Engineers supervised section chiefs, who in turn managed foremen and work gangs. Contract agreements from the early 1890s define responsibilities for each tier and specify penalties for missed targets. Payment schedules were linked to measured completion of surveyed segments. Provincial treasury files include reconciled accounts comparing planned and actual labor expenditures. Food and shelter logistics formed a parallel administrative network. Supply contracts preserved in Tobolsk and Tomsk archives detail flour shipments, dried fish allocations, and fuel deliveries to temporary camps. Storage ledgers record spoilage rates and emergency reserves. Kitchen supervisors submitted weekly consumption reports, which were reviewed alongside payroll statements. Bridge construction required concentrated deployment. Planning papers for the Ob River crossing near Novonikolaevsk in 1893 specify workforce rotation cycles, pile driving quotas, and barge schedules. River gauge readings and ice reports were attached to these plans. Work phases were timed to seasonal conditions, with contingency labor pools identified in advance. Urban development followed similar organizational principles. Municipal minutes from Tashkent in the 1870s assigned drainage and paving crews by block number. Attendance sheets accompany budget approvals. Samarkand land registers include compensation tables for relocated residents, and labor allotments for grading operations. Brickworks production logs were matched against construction timetables. Mining districts illustrate another scale of coordination. Altai Mining Administration records from the 1880s list extraction crews, ore transport brigades, and smelting teams. Output was expressed in poods and converted into casting quotas. Foundry ledgers link each batch to downstream construction orders. Transport vouchers trace movement from mine to rail depot. Telegraph and postal lines relied on distributed labor. Pole installation crews were assigned to fixed distance intervals. Progress reports reference kilometer posts and terrain classifications. Wire and insulator shipments appear in customs and warehouse registers. Storm damage triggered standardized repair deployments recorded in daily logs. Workforce composition varied across regions and seasons. Census schedules from 1,897 identify concentrations of stonecutters, carpenters, and metalworkers in provincial towns. Employment contracts specify term length, housing provisions, and disciplinary rules. Seasonal migrants appear in temporary payroll supplements, often marked with place of origin codes. Financial supervision connected projects to central administration. Annual budgets allocated funds by sector and district. Expenditure summaries were forwarded to ministries with comparative tables. Deviations required written justification. Approval memoranda include annotated recalculations and revised disbursement schedules. Qing administrative records show parallel labor accounting. Provincial memorials list canal dredging volumes, timber requisitions, and corvée labor quotas. Registers convert labor days into standardized work units. Material and manpower requests were evaluated together before authorization. Procurement processes linked exhibitions and construction sites. Contractor selection files reference machinery and materials displayed at industrial fairs. Purchase orders include capacity ratings and delivery sequences. Asset registers track deployment of acquired equipment to specific locations. Transport coordination underpinned these systems. Freight schedules from 1,895 indicate priority consignments of rails, sleepers, and cement. Delay reports assign cause categories and estimate labor idle time. Revised timetables are appended to original plans, showing adjusted completion targets. Insurance and inspection added further controls. Policies covered work camps, bridges, and storage depots. Inspection certificates verify load limits and structural conformity. Claims dossiers contain itemized labor and material losses after accidents or floods. Technical training intersected with labor management. Graduate rosters assign newly qualified engineers to active construction zones. Performance reports evaluate crew productivity and compliance with safety standards. Instruction manuals outline crew organization and reporting duties. Harbin's early development illustrates integrated labor logistics. Construction files from 1,898 onward include multilingual payrolls, phased staffing plans, and warehouse inventories. Customs entries record imported machinery. Housing allocation lists show how workers were distributed across districts. Climatic adaptation required systematic planning. Winter work programs include fuel consumption tables and heated shelter capacities. Frost-resistant mortar recipes appear in site notebooks. River ice thickness measurements determine permissible load weights for transport convoys. Communication systems maintained operational coherence. Circulars standardized report formats. Telegraph messages conveyed labor shortages, medical emergencies, or surplus supplies. Central offices compiled these inputs into consolidated situation summaries. Across projects, numerical coordination remained central. Materials were ordered by specification codes. Crews were assigned by headcount and skill category. Distances were referenced to surveyed benchmarks. Each operation produced corresponding documentation. Visible structures emerged from these cumulative processes. Masonry halls, rail corridors, and river bridges correspond in archives to measured outputs and scheduled tasks. Contemporary records associate scale with managed labor and calibrated supply, rather than with undocumented capability. Administrative arithmetic sustained construction over long distances and varied terrain. Ledgers, contracts, and schedules synchronized thousands of participants, The archival record links technical ambition to systematic workforce organization, demolition permits, and the managed disappearance of structures. Inspection notebooks kept by the Orenburg Municipal Engineering Office open, with inventories of unstable staircases, fractured load-bearing walls, and subsiding foundations. Each entry is followed by a short recommendation: reinforce, restrict access, or remove. Page numbers correspond to separate permit files stored in parallel cabinets. Together, these records formed the preliminary stage of formal demolition procedures long before any physical dismantling began. Urban administrations treated building removal as a regulated technical process. Structures were evaluated according to age, function, and material condition. In Tomsk, council minutes document surveys of deteriorating warehouses along the riverfront. Engineers submitted written assessments describing moisture penetration, timber rot, and uneven settlement. Only after these reports were reviewed were clearance measures approved. Fire regulations played a central role in accelerating demolition. After major fires in Irkutsk and Tobolsk, inspection commissions catalogued damaged districts. Their reports contained block-level inventories of collapsed walls, scorched beams, and unstable chimneys. Property owners received formal notices specifying deadlines for removal. Compliance was verified through scheduled site visits. Permits required detailed material accounting. Salvage registers list quantities of reusable brick, timber, and iron fittings. In Tashkent, late 19th century records show reclaimed stone transferred to municipal depots. These materials were later assigned to new projects through internal requisition forms. Waste disposal was regulated through designated dumping zones marked on city maps. Demolition was closely linked to reconstruction planning. Urban development offices prepared replacement layouts before clearance began. Cadastral maps were revised to reflect new parcel boundaries and street alignments. In Samarkand, rebuilding schemes include drainage corridors and revised property divisions. Compensation schedules for displaced residents were attached to these plans. Railway infrastructure followed similar protocols. When stations or depots required replacement, transport ministries issued dismantling orders. Files from Krasnoyarsk describe the removal of wooden platforms and their substitution with masonry structures. Work schedules coordinated clearance crews with incoming material shipments for new foundations. Military facilities generated parallel documentation. Barracks and supply depots deemed obsolete were dismantled under engineering supervision. Army archives contain inventories of recovered materials and redeployment orders. Temporary structures erected during campaigns were removed according to standardized post-conflict directives. Qing administrative systems reflected comparable practices. Provincial Yemen files include petitions for clearing unsafe market buildings and administrative compounds. Reconstruction memorials outline revised layouts and labor allocations. Material redistribution appears in attached schedules submitted for approval. Natural disasters intensified regulatory involvement. After the Verny earthquake, assessment teams classified buildings into repairable and irreparable categories. Irreparable structures were marked on survey maps using standardized symbols. Debris clearance contracts were awarded through documented bidding procedures. Flood events produced similar administrative sequences. Embankment failures in Western Siberia led to the removal of damaged warehouses and residences. Hydraulic engineers evaluated sediment accumulation and foundation erosion. Demolition permits referenced these technical findings. Industrial zones were frequently reconfigured. Factory inspection reports sometimes required removal of outdated workshops that failed safety standards. In Altai mining districts, smelting sheds were dismantled after equipment modernization. Salvaged timber and iron were entered into inventory books and reassigned. Insurance documentation extended the paper trail. Claim files contain photographs, engineer statements, and cost estimates for dismantling. Settlement agreements specify rebuilding obligations or relocation terms. Copies of these materials were filed with municipal and provincial authorities. Urban renewal programs expanded demolition activity. In Harbin, railway administrators reorganized entire districts to accommodate increased traffic. Planning files outlined phased clearance zones and temporary housing arrangements. Payroll records tracked debris removal teams and transport crews. Public health concerns also influenced removal decisions. Sanitary committees ordered demolition of overcrowded housing during cholera outbreaks. Inspection reports list ventilation failures and waste accumulation. Clearance orders cite medical assessments and statistical summaries. Demolition operations were subject to technical supervision. Engineers monitored dismantling sequences to prevent uncontrolled collapse. Safety manuals prescribed scaffolding systems and staged disassembly. Incident reports document accidents and subsequent revisions to procedure. Material reuse shaped reconstruction economies. Brick and stone from dismantled buildings were frequently incorporated into schools, hospitals, and offices. Transfer vouchers trace movement from demolition sites to storage yards. Quality assessments determine suitability for reuse. Municipal correspondence reveals administrative negotiation. Letters address schedule delays, labor shortages, and disputes over salvage rights. Marginal annotations record arbitration decisions. These exchanges illustrate the bureaucratic coordination underlying physical change. Mapping offices integrated clearance data into revised plans. Updated sheets marked vacant lots, relocated utilities, and new street grids. Comparisons of maps from successive decades show systematic reconfiguration. Former building footprints were replaced by standardized parcels. Photographic surveys provided visual records. Planning departments assembled albums depicting clearance zones with numbered reference markers. Captions link images to permit files and reconstruction stages. These photographs were appended to progress reports. Rural settlements operated simplified versions of these systems. Village councils documented dismantling of flood-damaged barns and bridges. Provincial guidelines governed material reuse. Local archives contain abbreviated permit forms and inspection notes. Political transitions intensified removal activity. Administrative reforms required new office complexes and transport facilities. Older structures were cleared to accommodate these projects. Budget proposals include demolition costs alongside construction estimates. Economic shifts also prompted reconfiguration. Declining trade routes left warehouses unused. Property departments surveyed vacant buildings and scheduled removal. Throughout these processes, demolition functioned as an administrative task. Surveys, permits, inventories, and inspections governed each stage. Physical disappearance corresponded to documented authorization. Each dismantled structure generated a layered record of assessments, approvals, and material transfers. These files preserve institutional traces long after physical removal. Reconstruction proceeded through regulated sequences. New foundations were laid only after clearance certificates were issued. Utility lines were repositioned according to updated plans. Inspection reports verified compliance before occupancy. Urban surfaces changed through cumulative administrative actions. Streets widened, parcels redefined, and districts reorganized. These transformations appear across synchronized archives of maps, permits, and financial ledgers. Archives, photographs, and the construction of memory. Bundles of rolled maps and wrapped glass negatives were stored in long wooden cabinets inside provincial record rooms, arranged according to internal numbering systems that were updated each year. Inventory cards attached to cabinet doors listed shelf ranges, container types, and transfer origins. Clerks checked these cards against ledger entries whenever materials were issued or returned. This physical arrangement governed how technical records were located and preserved. Written documentation formed the core of institutional memory. Provincial offices forwarded duplicate reports to central repositories. Construction files, inspection summaries, and correspondence packets were classified under standardized codes. Index volumes, cross-reference locations, project identifiers, and responsible departments. Access depended on familiarity with these internal systems. Photographic archives expanded alongside administrative reporting. Engineering departments employed photographers to document infrastructure projects and urban modifications. Albums preserved in Kazan and Irkutsk show bridges under assembly, cleared neighborhoods, and completed administrative buildings. Each image bears a reference number linked to written files. Photography functioned as formal evidence. Inspection dossiers often included mounted prints illustrating corrosion, cracking, or settlement. Insurance assessments required visual documentation. Demolition permits were supplemented with photographic records. These images were filed with technical reports to form integrated case files. Survey and mapping offices generated parallel visual records. Sequential editions of city plans and regional maps were stored in chronological series. Revisions were marked with colored inks and marginal annotations. Explanatory notes identify reasons for modification, such as route realignment or boundary adjustment. Railway administrations maintained specialized visual archives. Construction stages, track realignments, and station expansions were recorded using standardized viewpoints. Albums from Krasnoyarsk and Chita display repeated framing conventions. Captions reference contract numbers and engineering reports. Museums and libraries absorbed selected portions of these materials. Institutions such as the Polytechnic Museum in Moscow catalogued engineering drawings, exhibition catalogues, and photographic sets. Accession books record donor agencies and classification categories. Curators organized holdings by technical field. Personal collections supplemented official records. Engineers and surveyors retained working copies of plans and correspondence. Family deposits in regional archives contain annotated blueprints and contact prints. These private materials often parallel institutional files. Qing repositories preserved comparable documentation. Provincial archives stored cadastral registers, memorials, and construction diagrams. Port city photographic studios produced systematic urban surveys. Albums from Tianjin and Harbin follow standardized documentation formats. Translation bureaus shaped archival interpretation. Foreign reports were adapted into administrative terminology. Revision registers document approved wording changes. These practices influenced how technical information entered permanent collections. Cataloging systems determined record visibility. Some materials were indexed by project series, others by administrative district. Unclassified items were placed in general collections. Frequently requested files were recopied, while rarely consulted materials remained in storage. Archival consolidation accompanied bureaucratic reform. When ministries reorganized, record offices merged. Transfer manifests list contain accounts, damaged folders, and missing attachments. These documents trace the movement of collections between institutions. Photographic negatives required specialized care. Glass plates and film reels were stored in controlled environments. Conservation logs record cleaning, duplication, and stabilization procedures. Damaged originals were sometimes replaced by printed copies. Access policies shaped historical use. Reading room registers record visitor names and file requests. Certain technical collections were restricted. Permission systems influenced which materials entered academic and public circulation. Statistical publications relied on archival extraction. Compilers gathered figures from inspection reports, financial accounts, and census returns. Published tables became secondary reference sources, often consulted independently of original files. Periodicals reprinted selected archival images. Illustrated journals reproduced bridge photographs and urban plans. Editorial captions simplified technical contexts. These reproductions circulated beyond institutional audiences. Educational programs incorporated archival samples. Students analyzed historical blueprints, maps, and maintenance logs. Teaching collections emphasized representative examples rather than complete series. Preservation practices varied by locality. Some archives maintained systematic conservation programs. Others experienced losses through fire, moisture, or neglect. Damage reports list missing volumes and degraded photographs. Administrative correspondence reflects awareness of archival requirements. Letters request shelving, trained cataloguers, and binding supplies. Technological change altered record formats. Blueprint copying, photostat reproduction, and later microfilming expanded duplication. Authorization registers document approved copies. Multiple versions of plans circulated simultaneously. Exhibitions drew upon archival holdings. Loan agreements list materials temporarily transferred for display. Return inspections verified condition. Some items entered permanent museum collections after exhibition use. Publishers accessed archival sources. Atlas producers and handbook editors submitted permission requests. Royalty agreements appear in ministry files. Published extracts condensed complex datasets. Over time, layered documentation accumulated around individual sites. Planning files, construction photographs, maintenance records, and demolition permits formed interconnected series. These dispersed references collectively shaped recorded histories. Organizational structure influenced interpretation. Files arranged by ministry emphasize administrative continuity. Geographic arrangements highlight spatial transformation. Thematic albums foreground technological form. Loss and duplication both affected memory. Missing folders created gaps. Duplicate copies preserved alternative traces. Inventory lists record these absences and substitutions. Archival practice reflected institutional priorities. Major projects generated extensive documentation. Routine operations produced minimal files. Selection occurred through administrative procedure. Records also show reinterpretation. Later annotations indicate reclassification. Stamp marks trace interdepartmental transfers. These layers document management of memory. Photographs and texts operated jointly. Images anchored measurements to visible forms. Reports placed images within regulatory contexts. Neither functioned independently. Cataloging, duplication, and controlled access provided durability. Records outlasted individual offices. Memory became embedded in filing systems. Accumulated archives mediate later understanding. Physical remnants are interpreted through preserved documentation. Institutional organization shapes historical perception. Maps, borders, and the administrative division of space. Field teams returning from survey routes submitted notebooks filled with angle readings, distance tables, and rough sketches of river crossings and mountain passes. These notebooks were reviewed by senior draftsmen who recalculated figures and transferred verified measurements onto master templates. Corrections were entered in red ink, and rejected values were crossed out with explanatory notes. This process transformed provisional observations into authoritative spatial records. Administrative governance depended on fixed territorial units. Provinces were divided into districts, districts into sub-districts, and sub-districts into registered parcels. Cadastral bureaus maintained detailed plans showing ownership, tax obligations, and land classification. In Western Siberia, land registers identify plots through triangulation points and river intersections. Each entry corresponded to fiscal and legal files stored in parallel systems. Survey commissions coordinated the production of these materials. Teams traveled with chains, compasses, and astronomical instruments. Field journals record calibration routines, observation sequences, and instrument maintenance. Completed notebooks were sent to regional mapping bureaus, where draftsmen converted raw measurements into standardized projections. Imperial authorities expanded these practices during territorial consolidation. Boundary commissions operating along Central Asian frontiers produced multi-volume documentation. Their reports include water access maps, settlement distributions, and transit corridors. Administrative orders defining jurisdictions cite these materials directly, linking governance to mapped evidence. Railway development intensified boundary precision. Transport corridors required exact alignment with property limits and district borders. Right-of-way plans specify acquisition zones and compensation areas. Surveyors marked parallel guidelines along routes. Revised editions recorded deviations caused by terrain or engineering constraints. Urban zoning followed comparable procedures. Municipal planning departments produced layered maps separating residential, commercial, and institutional areas. In cities such as Tashkent and Samarkand, zoning regulations were accompanied by color-coded sheets. Building permits referenced these plans to determine approved land use. Hydraulic management introduced further spatial classification. Canal authorities mapped watersheds, feeder channels, and distribution branches. Water rights registers link allocations to surveyed channels and gate positions. Dispute resolutions relied on these mapped records. Qing administrative mapping reflected parallel methods. Provincial and banner territories were charted using combined ground surveys and astronomical observation. Court archives preserve atlases showing patrol zones, tax districts, and military routes. These maps supported taxation and security operations. International borders required joint verification. Russian and Qing commissions exchanged measurement data and draft maps. Protocols describe reference markers and recalculation methods. Agreed coordinates were incorporated into official atlases and diplomatic records. Rural cadastral surveys extended these systems to villages and pasture lands. Boundary stones marked communal lands and cultivation zones. Simplified plans recorded forest reserves and grazing areas. Local councils maintained copies for taxation and dispute settlement. Riverine and coastal boundaries were regulated through hydrographic surveys. Navigation offices mapped channels, shoals, and floodplains. Jurisdictional limits for toll collection and policing appear on these charts. Revisions followed sediment shifts and seasonal changes. Standardization supported interdepartmental use. Central authorities mandated projection systems, scale ratios, and symbol sets. Instruction manuals guided lettering styles and legend construction. Uniform presentation enabled data exchange between ministries. Mapping bureaus preserved chronological series of revisions. Each edition integrated new surveys and administrative changes. Marginal annotations identify obsolete lines and superseded districts. Archive series allow reconstruction of territorial adjustments. Frontier cities developed through incremental mapping. Early reconnaissance sketches were replaced by cadastral grids and zoning plans. Harbin's planning archives show successive transitions from provisional layouts to regulated districts. Statistical agencies depended on map divisions. Census tables were organized by district codes. Economic reports referenced jurisdictional boundaries. Administrative geography structured numerical aggregation. Legal institutions relied on cartographic evidence. Court files contained certified map extracts used in land disputes and compensation claims. Surveyors submitted sworn statements confirming measurements. Maps functioned as legal instruments. Educational institutions trained specialists in geodesy and cartography. Course materials include triangulation exercises and legal geography modules. Graduates were assigned to survey departments and cadastral offices. Military planners integrated civilian mapping into defense systems. Restricted editions overlaid fortification zones and supply routes onto administrative divisions. Infrastructure projects required constant boundary verification. Road construction, pipeline installation, and telegraph routing depended on jurisdictional clearance. Permit files reference cadastral sheets to confirm authority. Administrative reforms triggered new mapping cycles. Provincial reorganizations required redrawing district lines. Committees evaluated population density, transport access, and revenue capacity. Draft maps include handwritten recommendations and revision marks. Natural features influence boundary logic. Rivers, ridges, and watershed divides served as reference lines. Survey reports document seasonal variation affecting these markers. Adjustments were recorded when features shifted. Publication followed layered review procedures. Draft sheets passed through technical, legal, and ministerial inspection. Approval stamps indicate compliance. Unauthorized alterations were rejected. Public circulation varied. Some boundary maps were distributed to schools and municipal offices. Others remained restricted. Lending registers document controlled access. Private publishers produced derivative atlases based on official data. Licensing files govern reproduction rights. Editorial correspondence discusses labeling conventions and scale adjustments. The archival record shows how physical landscapes were translated into administrative frameworks. Boundaries emerged through repeated measurement, verification, and documentation. Survey markers, cadastral sheets, and jurisdictional maps formed an integrated spatial system. Governance operated through these mapped references rather than through informal geography, registers, head counts, and the architecture of enumeration. Clerks in provincial registration offices maintained long tables of handwritten names, birthplaces, household sizes, and occupational titles. Each line corresponded to an individual entry, verified through local inspections and supporting certificates. Corrections were added in narrow margins, often initialed by supervisors. These registers formed the operational basis for population management across administrative districts. Systems of enumeration expanded alongside territorial mapping. Once districts and parcels were defined, residents were assigned to fixed locations within official records. Residency files linked individuals to specific streets, villages, and compounds. In Western Siberia, household books list occupants according to dwelling number and tax category. These documents connected physical space to demographic classification. Census operations followed standardized procedures. Enumerators received printed instructions detailing interview formats, verification methods, and reporting schedules. Field notebooks contain tallies of residents by age group, marital status, and employment category. Completed forms were reviewed at district offices before transmission to central statistical bureaus. The Russian Empire's census of 1,897 illustrates this system. Preparatory circulars specified questionnaire formats and coding rules. Supervisors cross-checked entries against parish records and municipal registries. Tabulation offices compiled regional summaries using mechanical counting devices and manual aggregation tables. Household registration extended beyond periodic censuses. Police departments and municipal councils maintained continuous population lists. Movement permits, lodging certificates, and work authorizations were filed with local offices. Arrival and departure registers tracked internal migration along rail corridors and river routes. Taxation relied heavily on these records. Fiscal departments assigned obligations based on registered household size and occupation. Revision lists and assessment rolls link demographic entries to payment schedules. Discrepancies triggered inspections and reclassification. Labor administration depended on population data. Recruitment offices consulted residency files when allocating workers to construction projects and industrial sites. Contract registers referenced census categories to determine eligibility. Seasonal labor movements were recorded through temporary registration cards. Military conscription systems drew directly from enumeration archives. Draft boards used age and residence data to compile service lists. Medical examination results were appended to personal files. Transfer records document reassignment between units and districts. Public health authorities also relied on demographic registers. Vaccination campaigns were organized by neighborhood lists. Mortality reports were cross-referenced with household books. Sanitary committees used these figures to allocate medical staff and supplies. Educational planning depended on population counts. School boards consulted census tables to estimate classroom demand. Enrollment ledgers linked student names to family registers. Funding allocations were adjusted according to district population figures. Qing administrative systems maintained comparable documentation. Household registers known as huangsei and later reforms recorded family composition, landholding status, and labor obligations. Provincial offices compiled summaries for taxation and corvée management. Updated copies were submitted regularly. Urban registration systems grew increasingly complex. In cities such as Harbin and Tashkent, residency cards included photographs, fingerprints, and employment references. Police archives preserved these files with serial numbers and renewal dates. Mobility within cities required administrative approval. Migration monitoring intensified with railway expansion. Station offices recorded passenger movements using ticket logs and residence permits. Border checkpoints maintained entry registers. These data were transmitted to statistical departments for analysis. Statistical bureaus transformed raw registers into aggregated datasets. Clerks sorted forms by district code and demographic category. Annual reports present tables of birth rates, literacy levels, and employment distribution. Classification systems standardized interpretation. Occupations were grouped into approved categories. Ethnic and linguistic identifiers were codified. Instruction manuals defined acceptable terminology. These rules shaped how individuals were represented in official statistics. Legal systems incorporated demographic documentation. Court files include certified extracts from household registers. Residency status affected jurisdiction and eligibility for certain rights. Identity verification relied on registration certificates. Church and religious institutions contributed parallel records. Parish books documented baptisms, marriages, and burials. These registers were periodically compared with civil files. Discrepancies prompted joint reviews. Private employers maintained supplementary lists. Factory personnel files include residence details, family dependents, and employment history. These records were sometimes shared with municipal authorities for taxation and housing allocation. Archival preservation extended to population data. Census forms, registration cards, and summary tables were bound into volumes and stored in climate-controlled rooms. Index systems allowed retrieval by district, year, and category. Errors and omissions were formally addressed. Correction petitions appear in administrative files. Investigation reports describe verification visits and document revisions. Updated entries replaced earlier versions through regulated procedures. Technological innovations altered enumeration methods. Tabulating machines and card systems were introduced in major statistical offices. Equipment inventories and operating manuals document their adoption. These tools increased processing speed and standardization. Publications disseminated selected results. Statistical yearbooks and demographic atlases presented simplified summaries. Editorial committees reviewed tables for consistency. Public readers encountered filtered versions of administrative data. Education and training supported these systems. Clerks attended courses in record management and statistical methods. Examination papers include exercises in tabulation and classification. Certification determined eligibility for registry positions. Demographic records accumulated layered histories. A single individual might appear in birth registers, school lists, labor files, military rolls, and mortality records. These interconnected entries form composite administrative profiles. Reforms periodically revised classification standards. New categories were introduced for emerging occupations and urban housing types. Circulars instructed offices to update registers accordingly. Transitional files preserve earlier formats. Population management depended on sustained documentation. Registration, verification, aggregation, and revision operated as continuous cycles. Each stage produced material for subsequent administrative use. The demographic archive links territorial divisions to human distribution. Maps defined where people belonged. Registers defined who occupied those spaces. Together, they structured fiscal, military, and social planning, continuity, revision, and the afterlife of records. Storage rooms in regional archives contain shelves of bound volumes marked with multiple institutional stamps, crossed-out catalogue numbers, and handwritten relocation notes. Some folders carry labels from 3 or 4 different administrative systems. Pages inside show layers of annotation added over decades. These physical traces document how records were transferred, reclassified, and reused as governing structures changed. Administrative transitions rarely erased existing documentation. Instead, incoming authorities inherited filing systems, inventories, and registries. Review committees examined existing collections and issued instructions on retention, disposal, and reorganization. Circulars preserved in ministerial archives describe how older records were to be integrated into new bureaucratic frameworks. Reclassification formed a central part of this process. Project files originally grouped by ministry were sometimes rearranged by geographic district or functional category. Index books were rewritten to reflect revised hierarchies. Old reference numbers were retained in margin notes to preserve traceability. Cross-reference tables linked former and current catalogue systems. Political reforms intensified these adjustments. When provincial boundaries were altered, record offices redistributed cadastral maps, census files, and tax registers. Transfer manifests list volumes reassigned to new jurisdictions. Clerks confirmed receipt through signed acknowledgement forms. Missing items were reported through standardized discrepancy notices. Legal continuity depended on preserved documentation. Property rights, infrastructure contracts, and pension entitlements relied on archived files. Courts requested certified extracts from older registers. Authentication stamps and signature verification protocols ensured institutional recognition across administrative changes. Archival consolidation accompanied governmental centralization. Smaller record offices were merged into regional repositories. Transport logs document shipments of crates containing maps, photographs, and account books. Conservation teams inspected materials upon arrival and recorded damage assessments. Revision practices extended beyond physical relocation. Statistical series were recalculated using earlier datasets. New reporting formats were applied retroactively. Tabulation manuals instruct clerks how to reconcile incompatible classifications. Revised tables were published alongside explanatory notes. Photographic collections underwent similar reinterpretation. Negatives were reorganized by subject or location. Captions were rewritten to reflect updated terminology. Some images were duplicated for thematic albums. Original sequencing was preserved only in internal registers. Maps and plans were frequently overprinted with new boundary lines and zoning codes. Transparent overlays were added to indicate administrative changes. Revision stamps mark approval dates. Superseded editions were retained for reference, not discarded. Educational institutions reused archival materials for training. Historical project files became case studies. Students analyzed earlier maintenance logs and planning maps. Teaching notes reference archive shelf numbers, integrating institutional memory into instruction. Research departments depended on inherited records. Engineering bureaus consulted 19th century surveys when planning upgrades. Water authorities reviewed historical canal maps before expansion. These consultations appear in correspondence files citing archival references. International agreements relied on preserved documentation. Boundary treaties and concession contracts required access to earlier maps and registers. Diplomatic archives contained certified reproductions of technical files. Verification protocols ensured continuity across regimes. Insurance and financial institutions maintained parallel archives. Policy histories and claim files followed properties through ownership changes. Reinsurance agreements reference original inspection reports. These materials linked private and public record systems. Technological changes affected record preservation. Microfilming and later photographic duplication created secondary archives. Authorization forms list copied volumes and storage locations. Redundancy reduced reliance on single physical collections. Archival losses prompted reconstruction efforts. After fires or floods, committees assembled replacement series using duplicates and external sources. Reconstruction reports list consulted repositories and recovered fragments. Gaps were formally recorded. Personnel continuity supported institutional memory. Senior clerks trained successors in legacy systems. Instruction notes describe obsolete coding schemes and filing conventions. Oral explanations were sometimes summarized in internal memoranda. Revision also occurred through reinterpretation. Later administrators added contextual notes to older files. Marginal comments explain outdated terminology or procedural changes. These annotations reveal evolving institutional perspectives. Public access policies evolved. Restrictions were reviewed periodically. Some files were declassified and reindexed. Reading room regulations document expanding consultation rights. Usage statistics influenced preservation priorities. Publishing practices reflected archival reuse. Historical infrastructure data appeared in new technical manuals. Editors cited original file numbers. Permission registers track authorized reproductions and adaptations. Urban redevelopment projects depended on layered records. Planners consulted construction photographs, maintenance reports, and demolition permits spanning decades. Integrated project files combined materials from multiple eras. Population registers were similarly reused. Later censuses referenced earlier household books. Migration studies drew on historical residency cards. Continuity allowed longitudinal analysis within administrative frameworks. Budget planning relied on historical expenditure files. Cost trends were extracted from archived accounts. Comparative tables informed new appropriations. These practices linked past operations to future projections. Archival policy documents emphasize preservation as administrative infrastructure. Storage, cataloging, and access were treated as operational necessities. Annual reports include statistics on processed volumes and restored items. Records acquired institutional authority through sustained handling. Authentication procedures, transfer protocols, and conservation standards reinforced legitimacy. Documents were treated as operational assets. The persistence of files enabled long-term coordination. Engineering systems, property regimes, and demographic classifications depended on accumulated documentation. New projects were anchored in inherited datasets. Administrative memory resided in material form. Paper, film, and maps carried validated information across generations of officials. Continuity depended less on individuals than on maintained systems. Revisions did not eliminate earlier layers. They added new structures over existing ones. Each reform produced additional indexes, summaries, and explanatory notes. The archive expanded vertically, as well as horizontally. The afterlife of records shaped institutional perception of scale and capability. Past projects were visible through preserved measurements, accounts, and images. Governance operated through accumulated documentation. Files linked territory, population, labor, and infrastructure into coordinated systems. Administrative practice rested on reference to recorded experience. The documentary landscape reflects sustained organizational effort. Preservation, revision, and reuse maintained operational continuity. Records functioned as instruments of governance long after original contexts had passed. Through successive administrations, these materials remained active. They were consulted, corrected, and repurposed. Institutional memory persisted through regulated archival processes rather than informal tradition. The technical and administrative record forms a continuous framework. It connects survey posts, construction logs, payrolls, and censuses into an enduring system of reference. Authority was embedded in maintained documentation. If this video made you interested, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Let us know what topic you'd like to see next, and thank you for watching.